We think that the worst part of the COVID pandemic might be over, might be behind us, but in fact, we only may still be coming to terms with the full impact of this virus. The cliche all through 2020 used to be that the virus was the great equalizer. In fact, here at the Mojo Story, as 1 year of traveling on the road with the pandemic showed us, as we followed the plight of migrant workers, the biggest exodus of Indians since the partition of India, we kept arguing that there was nothing more unequal than we had seen during this year of the lockdown, where the poor effectively became a sheath for the middle class and the upper middle class. And of course, the rich were not impacted at all. It was an absolute mythology to call this virus the great equalizer. As the debris is still settling down and people are trying to emerge from its remains, here's what Oxfam is confirming, something that all of our ground reports traveling, as we said, 25,000 kilometers through India confirmed to us. This was only going to make the rich richer and the poor much poorer. And it was possibly going to leave India's salaried class more vulnerable than ever before. Oxfam now is out with a report where it's calling out the virus for what it is, an inequality virus. In its inequality report released just today, there are some startling, absolutely startling statistics. And I am welcoming to the program now from Oxfam, Amitabh Behar. Welcome, Amitabh. And, I've been going through some of this data, and frankly, it just kind of confirms to me so much of what I saw firsthand. But let's take, for the benefit of our audience before you react, the fact that we could be looking at the biggest increase in inequality globally in 100 years, right? That is potentially what we're looking at. And if we take a look at some of these numbers and show how the rich, the wealthier, have actually done pretty well for themselves. And you pause to think about what happened to the poor. In India, consider this, 170,000 people lost their job every hour in April 2020. 170,000 lost jobs every hour in that first month of the lockdown. Unemployment for women rose by 15%. Women have been especially hardest hit, and that could knock out 8%. That could hit 8% of India's GDP potentially. And no one has actually paused to reflect on how women have been amongst the sort of sharper sufferers. 8 in 10 households saw a decline in income. We're only just beginning to hear these stories. It could take a while longer before the full aftermath of this is actually felt. And if you pause to consider the fact that India's rich only in fact got richer, and can we have that next set of graphics, that the wealth of Indian billionaires, what happened to Indian billionaires? The wealth of Indian billionaires actually increased by 35%. How did that happen? And will they heed this moment in history and do their bit? What about India's richest man, among the world's richest men, Mukesh Ambani? Mukesh Ambani's wealth rose by 75%. If you can wrap your head around that, 75% in this year of the pandemic. So what we're really looking at is a much more unequal country, a much more unequal world. This is not, of course, unique to India. This has happened globally. But what is unique to India is, I think, what we saw happen with the migrant workers and that, the transient workers who work in the city and live in the villages, and we're only just understanding what's happening to them. Amitabh, what leaps out for you in this report, in this research, that you think people didn't understand it? I mean, I called out one of the things, the media cliche was, oh, the virus knows sees no barriers. The virus saw all the barriers. The virus played out according to those barriers.
Thank you, Barkha, for doing those ground reports. And intuitively, as you could figure out from your ground reports, I think many of us were very aware of the unequal impact of this virus on people. What really stands out is the amount of wealth the super rich, the billionaires, have made despite the virus, and how we've really not acknowledged it. You gave the Indian figures. Let me just give you a couple of global figures. That globally, the top 10 billionaires have actually added $500 billion to their kitty. $500 billion. Mm-hmm. The top 1,000 billionaires, within 9 months, they did take a hit initially, but recovered. Whereas now every study, every report is telling us that the poor, ordinary people will take at least a decade to come back to pre-pandemic level. I think that's the real story. That's the differential recovery that we're looking at. The
Yeah.
top ones within 9 months are back, and few are making huge profits. And on the other hand, you're looking at a mass of billions of people who are not able to get food on their table and will need at least a decade to come back to where they were in February, March 2020. That's the real
A
story
decade.
that
You're
people
going
are
to
not really
say a
talking about.
decade. You're going to say that the poor are going to take 10 years to come back to pre-pandemic level. 10 years.
10 years. And this is not just the Oxfam study. Even the World Bank has recently come up with this study, where they clearly say that it is going to take a decade for ordinary people to come back to pre-pandemic levels.
Wow. What really leapt out to me is how well our billionaires did in this time. The fact that the jobs were being lost at the pace that they were, I was witnessing firsthand. I, of course, had no exposure to how the rich were doing. If we can just take another look at that set of graphics on how India's billionaires, their wealth increased by 35%. And, just to take one example, this has happened with Jeff Bezos in America, it's happened with Ambani in India. Individually, the wealthy actually did very well. Amitabh, how do we make sense of the fact that when the economy was ravaged, when the country was in lockdown, the billionaires continued to grow? Was it the nature of their business, or was it just that they were so rich? And there's a dissonance in India with the Sensex hitting 50,000. It's like two parallel nations.
Absolutely. Barkha, the big message I would say is that at least now with this story, with the graphic that you've just shown, people must recognize that a huge number of billionaires is not a sign of economic success. I would
Correct.
actually say it is a sign of economic failure. As in, if during pandemic, with what we have seen, if you're seeing people making huge amount of wealth, as in just imagine, our richest man, Mukesh Ambani, was making 90 crores every hour. That's the level of wealth they were adding to
90
their
crores every hour. 90 crores
every,
every hour. I'm one of those who finds it difficult to know how many zeros there are in a crore. So I need to wrap my head around this figure. 90
but
crores
it is
every
90
hour.
crores every hour. And that's the same time when 24% of Indian population was living with 3,000 rupees a month. So, just look at the contrast. Sure, it is about the nature of business, but it is essentially about a rigged system. It's a rigged economic system which lines the pockets of the super rich and the billionaires. So it's so rigged in favor of the billionaires that it does
And
not.
what do you mean? What do you mean by rigged? Like the fact is that it would be too lazy of us to sort of find fault with the billionaires. You're talking about a system that is set up to protect the rich and expose the poor. And I want to share with you a little story. When I just started my travels on this pandemic, and we covered by the end of it about 15 states, 25,000 kilometers. Can we actually take a different bunch of shots which actually really capture the poverty? These are actually pictures that capture the lockdown. But what I was going to tell you was that as I met these workers, as I met migrant workers, and I met them everywhere I went, and they telling their story became my magnificent obsession. I met a migrant worker's family from Bihar, and this worker was a painter. He used to do odd jobs painting at sites, and he sold his phone. And this ended up becoming like something I saw very often. He sold his phone for 2,000 rupees, and it was very hot still. It was still April, and he bought a table fan with that phone, Amitabh, and then he gave the money to his family to buy some grains because they had no work at all. And then he basically took a piece of cloth and he committed suicide. It was death by suicide. And I met the family the next day in this slum tenement in Haryana, and I couldn't sleep for days after that because 2,000 rupees was the value he placed on his own life and his family, right? And then you contrast this with what you're showing us here. And I just have to keep wondering, was the lockdown a gigantic mistake?
So, as in, without getting into the rationale for the lockdown, I
Yeah.
think what we need to recognize is that the way it was implemented was hugely problematic. It was probably the strictest lockdown globally. Even South Africa, which everybody was saying was very strict, gave 48 hours for its people. I think, but after the lockdown started, you probably made a mistake, I would say, in not giving people time. But after that, once you start seeing the heart-wrenching stories, as in the stories that you were doing around Oxfam also does humanitarian work. So we were providing food to people.
Yeah.
Everybody was aware that people did not even have access to food. They did not have access to shelter. And in those times, then to actually see the lockdown as a law and order issue. I think, what was really heartbreaking was the stories like what you've just shared, but also that the police is then still doing a lathi charge on those people who are walking
I'll,
home.
I'll tell you the story of a man. It's on our platform on the Mojo Story. It's our most watched video. It has some millions of views. It is the story of a rickshaw driver who I meet outside a hospital in Delhi, Amitabh. And I see him sitting outside the hospital in tears. I think he's COVID positive. I talk to him, but instead he's actually been beaten by the police. And I ask him, why have you been beaten by the police? And he says to me that he walked, instead of within the zone that he was supposed to be in the lockdown, he walked to a wholesale sabzi bazaar because he needed to buy the vegetables for cheap. The police thrashed the shit out of him because he was outside of that zone, then deposited him at this hospital where he was just sitting weeping. And that was my problem with the lockdown, right? I think across the world, people haven't figured out what the best response was to COVID. Many countries in the West are still struggling with this, but that it was imposed as a curfew.
Exactly.
Right? As opposed to buying time for the medical system. That became a kind of brutally, like you said, the brutal face of the police, and it really made the poor suffer.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that was hugely problematic. As in, at least in a week's time, 10 days time, the government could have said we are restarting railway services. We are going to provide buses. Nothing of that happened, which again shows, at some level, it is this whole bubble that the middle class lives in, and the policymakers probably interact with them, that you're comfortable if the middle classes are all right. They went back to their homes. And in Delhi, I heard this from a lot of people. Oh, we are hearing the birds chirping, which is very nice. Children are doing lovely online classes. They're comfortable. So people started seeing it as if it's a time for family bonding and relaxation. People wanted to rediscover their hobbies.
And bake banana bread. I don't think I could bear by the end of it to see any more videos of banana bread or photographs from Maldives.
But on the other hand, just imagine those people walking hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in that 42, 44 degree temperature without any food, without any security of whether they'll be able to come back. I think it's a devastating failure of the entire economic social structure that we have created. And that's something. What is very sad is that that's gone largely unnoticed. And we believe as if we are back to normal.
Let's take a look at some of the more data that's emerging from this Oxfam Inequality report, and it's the great digital divide, right? And the point is that we don't even stop to think about it. Again, our travels showed us that the poor was simply falling out of the school system. And by the way, your report, of course, says that 32 crore children have been hit by the closed schools, and 1/3 of these may never actually end up going back to school, right? So we don't right now know when all schools will physically open, and it's a kind of strange country where cinema theaters have opened before schools have, but 1/3 of India's students may never return to school. Now, I have met child after child who's actually spoken to me about not being able to partake of the school curriculum because they simply either don't have internet or they don't have a computing device. We have the horrific case of a suicide that took place of an auto rickshaw driver's daughter in Lady Shriram College because she didn't have a laptop, and I think she just felt mortified that her dreams were never going to come true. This digital divide, how is it going to hit education? And by the way, this is hitting lower middle class and middle class families too. There are any number of parents who are talking to me about their children being thrown out of posh public schools because they haven't paid fees on time and so on. Schools have not reduced their fees.
So again, it's a huge challenge that we're looking at. And I don't think that we have even started to address this mammoth challenge. You talked of the digital divide. Just give some figures in rural areas, and I'm not talking of the weaker sections, but just in rural areas. The penetration is 4% households have computers and 15% have internet access. If you actually go to the poorest 20%, then it's something like 3% who have access to computers, and 8% who have access to internet. So that's the level of access that you're looking for these children. And then, the question that at least we clearly know is that in the same one room, there'd be three kids living with their parents. Where do they get that space? So this digital divide is going to be devastating. Malala Fund has come up with a study which says that at least 20 million girls, so there's also a gender dimension to it, will not be able to come back to school. They'll get sucked into ultimately homework, unpaid care work, etc. And the gender divide is also something that we have not addressed. So it's surprising that our discussions, our conversations happen so much around reviving the economy, which is very, very important.
Yeah.
But if we don't look at questions of what's going to happen to the next generation, how do we build our future?
Yeah, let's go back to the economy, right? The poor, of course, have suffered massively, and your report is correct in saying, and this is something I kept saying through the lockdown, that when you do a copy and paste model from the West, you do not realize that in India, actually 90 million households live in one room structure, so you're pushing 8 people into a single room. So stay at home is actually less safe than going out for a walk in the park. We failed to understand. We panicked and we implemented that draconian lockdown. But let's turn our focus back to the economy. The middle class is suffering. The salaried class is suffering. And CMIE is among organizations, and now yours, that has put a number on it. And I just want to bring up that slide again, if we can, of the 170,000 jobs that were lost every hour. I'm still internalizing this figure because we are globally talking about the biggest possible increase in inequality in a century. But in India, as it applies, if you pick up the data from April, that's 170,000 people lost their job every hour. Amitabh, do you just want to talk about that number a little bit?
Sure. So as in, what we need to appreciate that in India, 90 to 92% actually work in the informal sector. And 75% of the job losses that we've seen have been in the informal sector. And then again, at the cost of repeating, there's again a gender dimension to the informal sector. So what is very important for us is to understand that the people who are losing their jobs are the ones who have not had job security. They're the ones who don't have social security, and they're the ones who don't have access to basic services. So it is a larger systemic question, which, at least on the brighter side from the pandemic, this should have been thrown up. It should have become the most talked about conversation in terms of how do you reboot your economy. These should have been the real questions, that can you ensure when you're looking at a post-COVID recovery, then you're ensuring that people get financial support, people get job security, people are moving from the informal sector to the formal sector. I think if you don't look at these systemic questions, then inequality will continue to grow, and the outcomes are going to be absolutely terrible.
Now, you have recommended, and this could be controversial, and I want to bring up those slides, a kind of COVID cess. And you're saying that basically anyone who earns about 50 lakhs per annum and above should have a 2% extra tax on them. And then you look at companies that have actually made windfall profits. And I find that less problematic than what you're expecting the upper middle class maybe to do. But here it is, temporary cess on companies that made a windfall profit. And I want you to talk a little bit about what you have in mind here. And finally, of course, you're asking for something that much of corporate India is also asking for, that you need to slash your GST figures. But of course, the government may not agree to do that because it's already short on revenue at this point. Now, let's start with this 2% cess. The finance minister did allude to a COVID cess. I think at this point, it would make the middle class in India's upper middle class quite angry, because there's a sense in the tax-paying Indian community, because such few people pay tax, that they are basically made to carry for the failures of the Indian state and for the inefficiencies of government, any government.
So, sure, this is something which is often debated, but Barkha, we are also living in absolutely unprecedented times, and that needs to be recognized. This is a time when globally there is this conversation about wealth tax, And this is not that India is going to be unique. Argentina has already put a levy on the super rich. South Korea is talking about it. Vietnam is talking about how does it become central to their 10-year recovery plan. So these conversations are happening around us. And
But
I,
let me pick up a question from the live stream, and I
yeah.
think it's a fair question. And the question says, Mukesh Ambani did not gain at the expense of the poor, so it's wrong to make him the poster boy for the suffering of the poor. I don't think that's the point you were trying to make, or the report is trying to make. I think the report is just pointing to structural inequities. But I do want you to respond to this comment.
So, absolutely, thank you, Barkha, for saying what I would have said. That this is certainly not personal. It's
Yeah,
absolutely not personal. It's not about Mukesh Ambani, because if it was not Mukesh Ambani, it would be someone else.
yeah,
But it is a structural problem that we are raising. That why in these times of pandemic also, why can't we have a better redistributive system where the people who are suffering so immensely would have got some support. So that's really the point that we are making. And I just wanted to come back to your question about 50 lakh. We have not had poverty figures in this country for a while.
yeah,
uh, we need to also have a better sense, as in if you don't even track your own poverty figures, how will you do policies? But
yeah.
let's look at the last few poverty figures that we had. 10 years ago, Arjun Sen Gupta committee said 78% people live in this country with less than 20 rupees a day. That's 10 years. Yes, it's dated. But even later in 13-14, we saw 23 to 25% living below the poverty line. Those are probably the last few figures.
Mhm.
Let me just remind us that our poverty figures are essentially a hunger line. We have not moved on to a more multidimensional understanding of poverty. It would
Yeah.
be great if the Niti Aayog starts doing that. But I just wanted to make that point that if 78% people 10 years ago lived with only 20 rupees a day, or 25% actually did not get enough nutrition, that means they were sleeping hungry. 50 lakhs is a significant amount. And you can argue, I'll not, I'll be very flexible if you say it's not 50, if it's 55 or 60 lakhs. But the point is that this is really the super wealthy that you're looking at. And on the other hand, there are people who do not have, as you just said, somebody for 2,000 rupees committed
Yeah.
suicide.
Yeah.
So let's look at the reality of this country and move ahead.
But shouldn't it be more like there almost has to be like a moral moment in the country, right? Like I would almost look towards these sort of super wealthy corporates to say, hey, listen, this is your moment to do your bit by your country.
Absolutely. But let me
But
also say,
a state enforced cess may seem less than fair to people. And the argument would be, let me just complete my point, that in the West, the fixing the economy has been almost as much of a priority as handling COVID, right? So whether it's countries in Europe where those who've lost their jobs are still earning 60 to 80% of their income, or whether it's corporates who are being compensated by states for their for lack of business. There is a kind of incentivization. There's much greater government spending than we're seeing here. What Indians would argue is you're not seeing that level of government spending, and you're making the middle class and the upper middle class pay for, as I said, inefficiencies of governance.
sure. So, let me just, the point that you're making,
Yeah.
I would, on the face of it, absolutely say yes, they should do their bit. But let me just take you to a report by the Tax Justice Network. It says that every year, $425 billion are lost to countries because of tax dodging. So the
Mhm.
point is that we need to ensure that corporates and individuals are paying a fair share of their taxes. I think that's central. And in over and above that, if they're doing philanthropy, that's absolutely fantastic and
But,
wonderful.
but
They,
let me
they
just
must
let me just interject. Let me just interject. And there are those who'll call you anti-capitalist, anti-wealth. For example, I have a comment from Puneet on the screen. We should be celebrating people who are working hard and growing rich. We celebrate people who once used to sell tea and became prime minister. That's a good thing. Similarly, we need to celebrate billionaires, self-made billionaires in particular.
Sure. So, but tell me, as in, so Puneet, the question for you would be, is it really reasonable that a person can earn 90 crores in an hour? Are humans so different that one person earns for an hour 90 crores and 24% of this country, which would be what, at least 35 crore people, will have to live with 3,000 rupees a month? I think, one needs to recognize, as I said, this is not about celebrating or critiquing individuals. This is about a system which is creating those billionaires. I think the flip of the question is
Yeah.
that how come we are constantly looking at an increase of wealth amongst the billionaires? And that's the trend you're looking at in the last 20, 25 years. So, and it's not just the Oxfam report. Look at what Thomas Piketty is saying. He's giving you hard data that the levels of inequality in this country are again higher than what we had in pre-independence India. Isn't that a cause for worry? So,
So
so,
let's
you know,
talk
so
about let's talk about specific. Sorry, one more thing I do want to talk to you about again, which is something I experienced in my reporting, and that's a staggering figure. What's happening to poor people who are suffering from diseases, fatal diseases other than COVID, right? And I remember going to Aligarh and covering the story of these 5 girls who cremated their father, who was a tea seller, talking about tea sellers, because he just was not, he died from tuberculosis. He was just not able to get an ambulance in a COVID obsessed system. Similarly, have chronicled families of those who've died from kidney disease. Your figure, if we can bring up that slide, and I want you to explain it, shows a 64% spike in mortality among non-COVID diseases. A 64% spike in mortality. I wanted a little more detail on this. Like, what does this actually mean?
So, Barkha, it essentially says that during COVID times, during the lockdown, what we saw was people were not able to access the primary health centers.
Yeah,
On the one hand, on the other hand, what we also saw that a lot of essential drugs
yeah,
actually had much higher costs. So people were not being able to even access their life-saving drugs.
yeah.
So that's the other problem that we've had, and therefore the health outcomes, where we started focusing completely on COVID, the other critical health concerns got completely sidetracked, and that's resulted in this very very painful situation.
When you and what was the sort of sample size for you all to reach these figures? There will be some questions on methodology, how you
Sure.
reach
So
these figures. Yeah,
so that, I would request people to just look at our report. So all our data is essentially in India. It's taken from government sources. So
yeah,
this is not a survey that we have done, except the education one that you specifically talked of.
yeah.
That was a survey that we have done, in which the school teachers, just to be very transparent, are the ones who are saying that they worry about children not returning to the
So,
classroom.
so teachers are saying that anecdotally in their schools, a third of children are not, they think will not
Exactly.
come,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
third of children may not come back. Let that number just actually sink in. All right, we have a couple of minutes left. Prescriptions, where does this start getting fixed, Amitabh?
Sure. So let me just talk of 3 or 4 very specific things. One, more fundamentally, when we're looking at the recovery, let's put inequality at the center of it. Let's ensure financial support for people who have lost livelihood. Let's
Yeah,
ensure at least a free vaccine for people. They've suffered, they must at least get access to free vaccine. The
yeah,
second, and this has been really effective in fighting inequality, and that is investing in health and education.
yeah,
If you just look at health, we are from the bottom fourth from the bottom in terms of investments in public health. We need to, in a serious way, increase our investments in health and education. That would lead to much greater equality. Third, I think it's critical that we move from just a minimum wage to ensuring a living wage for everyone. And let me also say, what's important is, while we reboot the economy,
yeah.
can we start re-looking at more greener sectors, more livelihood generating sectors? Agriculture is one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, of course, it's shocking that this was the moment that some state governments chose to actually further dilute labor laws. So just to that point. Just to close, I want to share a little story. I remember talking to this little child as he was boarding a bus. This was towards the end of the lockdown, so you finally had some public transport and people weren't walking anymore. And he was boarding a bus from Maharashtra to his village in UP. And I said to him almost playfully, do you know, आपको पता है कि कोविड क्या है, कोरोना क्या है? He said, हाँ मुझे पता है. I said क्या है? I thought he'd give me some learned understanding of what the virus is. He said, कोरोना का मतलब मुझे खाना नहीं मिलता. That was this child's internalization. So if you were to close by explaining to Indians who haven't understood how this has ravaged our world as we know it in one line, what is that thing that leaps out at you? What is the year ahead that we're looking at?
So it's been a devastating year. As in, let's recognize, let's not look at privileges, but let's look at solidarity. I think, ultimately human civilization, the story of human civilization is about moving towards certain ideals. Let's move towards that. As in, if we miss this opportunity as well, it's very unlikely that we'll ever be able to create a compassionate and just society.
Thank you, Amitabh. Some really staggering reality checks there in that Oxfam Inequality report. I still remember meeting a domestic worker in the slums of Mumbai who said the following to me. ये एक ऐसी बीमारी है जो अमीर लेके आया जहाज पर और गरीब को इसने सड़क पर उतार दिया है. So I think that is something to remember today, and your report does remind me and back up what I found anecdotally with hard research and hard statistics. Please do pick up your copy of the Oxfam Inequality report. It doesn't make for easy reading, but it makes for necessary reading, and I think that's where I would leave it. Amitabh Behar, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really so much to think about in that, and thank you very much for talking to us at this point. And we will say goodbye. We will join you tomorrow, same place, same time, with another deep dive into the big stories of the day. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.